Welcome, everybody. I see you're all hopping in, you're joining us. I want to welcome you all. My name is Aisling Clardy. I work at the UNESCO Chair in Inclusive Physical Education and Sport at the Munster Technological University in Ireland. And this is the second webinar in inclusive martial arts being brought to us by the International Centre of Martial Arts for Youth Development and Engagement in South Korea. And this is a very special webinar, this one. I have some fantastic guests here to speak with you all. Just to share with you all, some of you may or may not know that the motto of the disability rights movement is nothing about us without us. And so with that in mind, we have some athletes sharing their perspectives. And so I will share with you, I will introduce each of the athletes, and then we'll move into some conversations, some questions and they'll each share their personal experiences, some tips and guidance and advice on their journey in martial arts and how you can be supported as a martial arts coach or instructor. And no matter what martial art it is that you operate in, I'm sure that there will be of benefit of value that, some of the martial artists here are panelists, they're from judo and karate, but no matter what your martial art is, there, a lot of the principles are relevant for all fields. Okay, and so we have, first of all, and so in no particular order, so we have Samantha Lunsford. Samantha is from the USA. Samantha has a black belt in karate, and she's been practicing for 5 years now. And Samantha has spina bifida, and this affects her spine. And since she's been paralyzed from the waist down since she was born, and she has a black belt in karate, which I said that at the beginning. So we also have Tanya Banot from the UK. Tanya also has a black belt in karate. Tanya has dyspraxia, and this is a neurological condition and a learning difficulty that specifically affects her ability to learn movement. So that's how it affects the learning component. And Tanya will share a little bit about what this actually is and how she and her coach work together to accommodate her needs. Then we have D'Artagnan Crockett. D'Artagnan has a black belt in judo, and he's also a Paralympic medal winner. So D'Artagnan is also an educator and a motivational speaker who shares the values of judo in terms of mental and emotional health, and he uses an evidence-based approach mixed with martial arts philosophies to do so. Any of you who were on the first webinar, you've already met Nick Hoekstra. Nick is a martial artist who has also a black belt in judo and a purple belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu. He has a lot of experience practicing many different martial arts in different countries around the world. Nick has been fully blind since he's 7 years of age, and on top of that, he does a lot of work. His primary work and research focuses on promoting inclusive education. He's currently working on his PhD in special education at the University of Kansas. So a warm welcome to all of our panelists, a warm welcome to each of you, our attendees, whether you're listening live or whether you're listening to the recording. You're all very welcome, and we hope that our conversation, our webinar today will have plenty of nuggets of wisdom and experience that will support you in your journey. So let's start with you, D'Artagnan. Would you like to share with us your journey with martial arts, how you got involved? So, and I didn't say, and D'Artagnan also has a visual impairment as well. So would you like to share with us your journey, how you got into martial arts and how it has been for you?
Absolutely. So I'm originally from Cleveland, Ohio. And that's, if you're not familiar with the US, that is like right center in the US. It kind of looks like a heart, so we call it the heart of the US. And I didn't get into martial arts. I didn't touch a judo gi until I was 18. I actually didn't get into sports until high school. So in high school, I was a 4-sport athlete, having wrestled, played track and field, football, and powerlifting. I found my athletic home, I guess, in wrestling and powerlifting, more particularly just combative sports. toward the end of my high school career, ESPN featured a documentary on myself and a friend called Carry On. And after that documentary aired, coaches who were on the Paralympic staff saw the documentary, and what they saw was I was a visually impaired athlete in a combative sport. And knowing that judo is a Paralympic sport, they immediately reached out and asked if I'd be interested in judo. And of course, as I said, not touching a judo gi until 18, I knew nothing about the sport, so I said yes. And thus began my journey into Paralympic judo. And when I first stepped into judo, I had no idea that adaptive sports existed, because all my life, it's as many of us on our panels know, getting any sort of adaptive equipment is incredibly expensive. It's not very accessible, especially if you don't have the income or the health insurance to meet it. And particularly sport. All the sports that I competed in what's considered able-bodied, but I don't necessarily like that term or agree with that term, because I've seen, like with myself, and I'm sure the panelists as well, have been more able-bodied than individuals who don't have impairments or limitations. So I haven't seen adaptive sport or sports for individuals with limitation, because again, I just kind of competed with the general pool. But my sport into Paralympic judo kind of took off when my coach saw potential. He saw in me, he saw the two-time bronze medalist in me before I even knew what that was, essentially. And so he gave me the opportunity to come out and train at the Olympic Training Center for judo without me having touched the sport or having any sort of name in it. And when I found that there was a world of adaptive sport, it just kind of opened me up to a lot more things, particularly with the martial art of judo. Like, as I competed, traveling the world and competing, I also saw that there were athletes who competed in combative sports who had other impairments other than just visually impaired. And if you're not familiar with Paralympic judo, the only classification for athletes are athletes of visual impairments or who are completely blind. And moving through that career, having like opened me up, it allowed me to kind of step into another role of activism for impairment rights. And it's been a really cool journey having coached not only visually impaired athletes, but athletes who were a part of our Wounded Warrior project. And that's something that's kind of taken off in the US for a while. And in that, teaching athletes who are missing limbs and things like that. And it's been a really cool journey, and I have learned a lot, and I'm excited to be here on the panel and to share more of my experience and more of what judo has given me in regards to me being a visually impaired individual, and kind of how it translates from the dojo, from the mat, over into real world application.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing that, D'Artagnan. It's really lovely, and I really look forward to hearing more from you. We'll definitely come back to you and ask you more about what it was that, what it is that you have received. Thank you so much. So Tanya, would you like to tell us a little bit more about yourself, a little bit more about dyspraxia? Because I think sometimes dyspraxia might be a health condition or a neurological condition that many people might not have heard of, and so to have you be able to share how that occurs for you and how it was that you ended up in martial arts and how it supported your journey.
Yeah. So what I think I'll do first is kind of give a rough overview what dyspraxia is before I kind of bring in the martial arts aspect. Mm-hmm. So dyspraxia, as you say, it's not a well-known condition. It's not a well-studied condition. One of the common things that many dyspraxic people often say is, that I wish I had a shirt that read, "No, I do not mean dyslexia." So dyspraxia, kind of the primary thing it's known for is the impact that it has on both gross and fine motor skills. So gross motor skills being, things like martial arts, things like riding a bike, catching a ball, walking, moving around in general, and then your fine motor skills being things like tying your shoelaces or writing or drawing. And it essentially, it makes both of those types of skills much more difficult to learn. There are other difficulties as well. So there's an issue with spatial awareness. There are issues with socializing. Possibly this might be due to partly to the spatial awareness, the difficulty in reading facial expression. It generally comes with a certain degree of muscle weakness. I'm personally not sure why that is. It might be due to a neurological difficulty with muscle recruitment. It might be, I mean, nobody really knows. It does also tend to come with sometimes quite hypermobile joints. I have hypermobility in my hinge joints. And there is some, not everybody experiences this, because the difficulty is, I mean, I would say to anybody who's watching this, if you go to the Dyspraxia Foundation website, you can look at a long list of symptoms and how they present in different age groups. But these symptoms also do vary quite widely from person to person, but there can also be a certain amount of comorbidity with certain autistic symptoms, but that's probably the thing that varies the most. So some dyspraxic people say, no, I don't experience that. People like me find that they experience it quite a lot. So in terms of martial arts, I got into that because I was told after being, assessed and diagnosed, you should either learn dance or martial arts to try and address the coordination issues to a degree. And I chose martial arts. And for a long time, I found it really frustrating. I couldn't understand the movements. But kind of after my instructor became really interested in, he started developing, he became very interested in biomechanics, and also physical fitness and conditioning, combined with the fact that my mother was a yoga teacher. That had a dramatic impact on, my ability to move and perform sports in general. And I took up a bunch of other sports, running, gymnastics, a bit of strength training. And it's just completely changed things for me, because the vast majority of dyspraxic people, they just think, I'm never going to be able to do sports. And they just go off and they just do something else. And they, spend their lives just kind of making jokes about, oh, I'm so clumsy. And I never wanted to do that. And I don't know that that's what we should be doing. I just want to kind of get across that it is possible to, even if you're dyspraxic, it's possible to kind of reach a level that you never thought you could, but it's absolutely necessary that you have the right instruction to do so.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you so much, Tanya, for sharing all of that and your insight, to share your personal experience. And we'll come back to how, because I know you and your coach, Simon, you've worked very closely, and, you learned together, of how to meet and accommodate your needs. Because it is important, sometimes it's when somebody's learning about disabilities, often you'll hear this kind of all the symptoms of what might be wrong with a person, and sometimes it helps to know if there's any safety considerations that may be associated. But really the most important thing is to see when your coach, or when you're with a coach that can see your potential. And that's something you mentioned as well, D'Artagnan. Your coach saw your potential in terms of you winning medals, probably even before you did. And so when you have a coach that is willing to look at what is possible here, rather than, I know oftentimes it can seem, if you're learning, it might seem like, oh, there's so many disabilities out there. How am I going to learn about them all? But when you can boil it down to what is different about this person's ability, I might be able to support them and work with them. It's not actually that complicated when it comes down to it. And I know you'll share more about how you and Simon work together, your coach. So thank you so much, Tanya. Samantha, would you like to share with us a little bit about your journey, how you got into martial arts and how you reached the point where you now have a black belt in karate?
Yes, so as you mentioned earlier, I was born with a condition called spina bifida. It affected all of the nerve endings and stuff from my waist down. I am partially paralyzed from the waist down and use a wheelchair full time. And getting into the martial arts, I was not convinced that I could do it. We had family that was saying, hey, you need to come check this out. And my family actually started before I did. And at the time, I was absolutely not. I did not see any way that it would be possible for me to physically do it until I went with them to a seminar. And the movements that I saw were ones that I knew physically I could do. And it was an open seminar, anybody could participate. So I jumped in and my family helped me out and explained what was going on, what each movement was used for. And I got caught in it from there. And one of my instructors, when I first started, actually got into a wheelchair with me. And we pretty much worked it through together and learned how to do it that way.
Okay, so your coach was learning along with you?
Yes,
you learned together.
Yes, it was a learning process for both of us. He was trying to learn what I had to go through, or as much as he could was trying to understand from my perspective so that he could then convey what I would need to do to be able to do each individual movement from my wheelchair.
Wonderful. And I really want to iterate there how, with Tanya, both Tanya and you, Samantha, your coaches didn't have a background in inclusion. It was just a willingness. And I know even in what we teach at the UNESCO chair, yes, of course, there's always tips and strategies for people to learn, but the willingness to get to know your athletes and find out what it is that they need and work with them really, well, it got you to the point where you've succeeded to get a black belt. Yeah, thank you, Samantha, for your share, and we'll come back to you. So Nick, how about you? Would you like to share with us your journey? I know you've experienced many different martial arts in many different places around the world.
Sure. So yeah, I started, my story is going to be, I think, quite similar to D'Artagnan. So I'm going to try to highlight where some of the differences are, but similar to D'Artagnan, I also began sports when I was in high school. Also started with wrestling. I think one of the things that's kind of important to highlight is oftentimes people with disabilities don't get as much physical movement as some other students, as some other kids and adults even. And part of that is due to a lot of misunderstanding in society or doubts around people's abilities. So I definitely originally got into sports because it was always part of my family. My dad was a wrestler. I used to wrestle with him when I was a kid, and I wrestled with my siblings. And when I got into wrestling in high school, a lot of it had to do with health benefits, just with physical activity, to lose weight and to just get in better shape. But also what it became thereafter, though, was a sense of community. For me, sports and the martial arts more specifically have always been my link to people and to the culture that I live in. With my work, I've traveled quite a bit. I've lived in Japan, Ecuador, Geneva, Switzerland, and Santiago, Chile. And with all of those trips, one of the first things I do is look for the local dojo, whether that be in judo, where I originally got my black belt, or Brazilian jiu-jitsu, which is what I'm currently practicing. The first thing I do when I move to a new city is look for that local gym or the local dojo. And those people I've realized will immediately become kind of my family and my community. And of course, because of, with exposure to so many different gyms, I've run into a lot of different types of responses, for everything from where I'm currently at, where people met me with open arms and just said, whatever we can do to support you, we're here to do that. And I've had the opposite extremes where I've had, entire clubs where nobody has wanted to work with me or compete with me or, even practice with me because they had such low expectations. But in all of these kind of experiences, the major kind of guiding theme has just been, you show up and you keep showing up. And eventually, I think individuals with disabilities have a lot of potential to change the minds and perspectives of the people that we interact with. So, I'm doing sports and martial arts for my own benefit because it's something that I find is good for me. It's something that I love doing, but there's also this kind of societal benefit where we're also helping kind of show the world too what we're capable of. And hopefully that is a wave that continues to spread outward. So yeah, that's kind of my story.
Yeah, thank you so much, Nick. Absolutely. I'm pretty sure I could see a few heads nodding there as you were sharing in agreement. And absolutely, the figures for children with disabilities are up to 3 times less likely to participate in physical education and get a physical activity. Some figures say even 5 times. It really depends. And women with disabilities there's some figures. And the data isn't very well recorded actually internationally, but some women with disabilities, some figures say 93% of women with disabilities don't get enough physical activity. So that's quite, we've a bit of work to do. And I think, of course, people with disabilities themselves pioneering, and I can see from all of you, you're definitely leading the charge. But wouldn't it be nice too if some of the coaches were there to meet you with open arms? Absolutely. And, many of the coaches that here or anybody listening to this, maybe I know those of you doing the MARI program, you're already on the road and many others, and just to say, to really point out once again that, yeah, of course, there's some training and education you can get, but, there's many coaches, even some of your coaches that didn't have the training that, they could work with you. I think that's a very valid point. So let's have some conversation, with each of us. So I'll ask a few questions to each of you, but I invite each of you on the panel to join in and interact, from here on. If any of you have anything somebody says that you agree with, or that even you have a contrasting experience or perspective, feel free to join in. I'd love to hear, and I'll start, let's start with well, let's stay with you, Nick, and to get your insight or your input into what you can share with coaches in terms of creating that inclusive environment, that inclusive space, and and we can open the floor to all of the others as well that we have with us.
Sure. There's 2 ways that I think that we can look at this. There are things that we coaches can do before a person with a disability ever steps foot into their club, their gym, their dojo. And these are, basic things that are good for everyone. We can make sure that we have a warm, welcoming environment. And some of those like practical things are make sure that our spaces are clear, that there's clear walkways through the center of your space, to get to, from where you put your shoes to where you put your backpacks, etc., depending on how the setup is, but making sure there's clear walkways. That helps everyone. That's going to help somebody who's older avoid tripping. That's going to help somebody with a disability. That's going to make sure that a wheelchair has a clean space. We want to make sure that other aspects of our gym, we don't have blaring loud music that's distracting or that can be overwhelming to people who are visually impaired or people with autism or etc. Those are things that we can do and we can think about before we ever have a person with a disability. But what's really key then is if you do have a student with a disability that's interested, you know, they're the experts. So work with them, you know, don't have, you know, you might have doubts, and that's normal. We all have doubts, especially when we're confronting something for the first time, but our best resource is just openly talk to people. You know, when my best experiences, it's just been speaking with my coaches, speaking with my senseis, and discussing, you know, what works best for you in this case, and how can we make this environment better? So I would have to say, you know, those are the two things that I can suggest. There's broader changes that we can do that are going to help make an environment more inclusive for everyone. But then if we do have a student, it's important to not sit on our doubts and let them kind of worry us to death, but just to have an open conversation and see, you know, what changes can you bring about together.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Nick. And I think, Samantha, that might even come in with how you were sharing a while ago, you know, about you and your coach really learning on the fly. Do you have any more insights or advice on how that, you know, how that worked for you in your circumstances?
Just kind of playing off what Nick just stated, making sure that you have an environment that is conducive to being inclusive, like you said, with wheelchairs, making sure there's nothing getting in the way. In our dojo, we work out of a church gym. So there's plenty of wide open space, and it's not a very distracting environment. It's very inclusive, and I would recommend any coaches to, if they have a student with any kind of disability or impairment, to, again, speak with them on learning about their impairment or their disability and figure out what way works best for them, because that not only makes it much easier to teach, but it makes you a much better teacher.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Samantha. Tanya, would you like to share with us how it was, you know, because I know your coach created a very warm, you know, he created this warm, welcoming environment where the two of you had a very close working relationship. And I know you have an example of how he, you know, with one of the moves was a shirigiri. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing that right. You know, would you like to share with people how it was that over the time when your relationship began to deepen, how it was you specifically worked together?
Yeah, I mean, so, well, firstly, you absolutely pronounced the shirigiri right. But, I mean, actually, for a long time, he didn't know that I had dyspraxia. Because when I joined that dojo, he wasn't the instructor. So when the previous instructor left, then he took over. And it kind of came about very, very organically. I think it was just down to the attitude that he had and the attitude that the organization, the Welsh Karate Union, had in general, which was basically that if somebody shows up and, you know, people can see that they're working hard and that they're putting in their best effort, they don't really worry so much about you know, the perception of what's the person's kind of natural ability. It's about what are you willing to put in. And I mean, you know, he always knew that I was one of the hardest workers in the room, so that kind of, but he also really encouraged that environment. And it was also the fact that he really encouraged that environment of really understanding the techniques. But with shirigiri, so this is a kick where, for those who don't know, you have to face your opponent and then you turn on one leg whilst kicking them with the other leg, whilst you turn and face away from them to kick them, and then you recover so that you're facing them. So you go full 360 degrees around, kick them whilst you're not looking at them, end up facing them. And I could not get this kick. I couldn't understand it. I wouldn't be hitting the target. So he had actually purchased a phone specifically that had this feature to help his students, where he would record them and he could play it back in slow motion so they could see exactly what they were doing. So he did that, and he would just kind of, he just kind of, as you say, began that conversation. You know, okay, so what do you think is going wrong? My kick's off target. Okay, why? And then we would slowly develop it through that. And then he would give me this this exercise of kicking the back of my leg repeatedly to get my footwork correct. And I mean, I actually can't remember all of the steps we went through, but it was kind of like we did this little bit of puzzle solving together. And as Samantha said, you know, it was that thing of him trying to understand what I was experiencing, getting into that mindset, and then saying, okay, now how do we fix it? But I mean, I think actually a better example is that there's one kata where you have to do a technique where the arm goes up and comes round and strikes down. And again, that was one I just couldn't get. But he came up with this very clever thing where he just would hold his hand there and he would say, punch my hand, punch my hand, punch my hand, strike down. He got me to do that multiple times. Then he hooked his finger around and just sort of guided my hand. And then without telling me he was going to do it, he let go, by which point it was ingrained in my muscle memory and I could do it. So it was kind of just, there isn't really a specific kind of technique or mechanism that he was using. It was kind of, you know, each time it would just be a case of problem solving. And as Samantha says, it's really individual. So for me, I'm a massive, you know, overthinker. So he would just explain the techniques in depth, and I would go away and be analyzing, okay, exactly which muscles do I need to move? And I'd go off and I'd like read a bunch of things about, you know, what does this muscle do? How's it connecting to this muscle? And then when he started to combine that with, because his fiance is actually, you know, she has a lot of knowledge in personal training. And when he started to combine it with fitness, I could make that intellectual connection between, okay, this is what the book is saying the muscles do. And then when we do the conditioning work, these are the muscles that ache. Oh, there's the connection between the intellect and the physical, you know, the physical body. Now I can start applying it to the movement. So it was a combination of that and him kind of taking his problem solving approach to each technique.
Mm-hmm. Wonderful. I'm hearing what I'm hearing a common thread throughout what I think you're all sharing is there is no one size fits all, isn't it, really, when the coach really has to problem solve, like you say, Tanya, and trust their professional intuition as well. When you realize that you don't need to have the answer when you go, you know, for the coach, or the instructor doesn't need to have the answer when they, at the beginning of the session, that's something that emerges as you work together. D'Artagnan, did you have anything to add there? I was wondering.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I'm just loving being a part of this panel. This is all fascinating. This is just
wonderful.
Something I would add, and I think this is definitely something that whether you're coaching someone, particularly in martial arts or combative sports, whether you're coaching someone with an impairment or a lack thereof, being trauma informed. So I'm not saying go read a bunch of books on trauma and become a psychologist, but understanding the definition of trauma being an event that has happened and not in the result of how an individual responds to that negative event. And the story that they kind of play on repeat within their heads. So understanding that definition in regards to who may or may not show up to your club or show up to your dojo. This is particularly true with individuals with impairments, particularly visible impairments. So my impairment isn't, I say that my impairment isn't visible because if you just look at me kind of at face value, you can't tell that I'm visually impaired. But that kind of took years and years and years of living in my body and hiding it because and I've done a research paper on this. Individuals in the US who have physical impairments, particularly ones that are visible, tend to have more violence inflicted against them from the general public, whether that's in schools, whether that's on the streets, whether that's in the home. Individuals who are already in this vulnerable category tend to be attacked or harassed more because of their impairments. And so what we'll see, and this is also true for just individuals who go into a martial art, sometimes it's not just about like learning something new, but like, I want to learn something to protect myself. And chances are they may have some sort of trauma tied to their reasoning. And same like with myself coming into sport. And just kind of jumping back a couple conversations and drawing back to like another distinction between me and Nick. My parents weren't athletes. I never grew up watching sport. And I played video games and I sang in a choir and I walked a bunch. So that was my life. Sports wasn't it. I got into sport because I was attacked. And from there, I used sport as a catalyst, as kind of like using a video game mindset of, these are individuals that are going to help me level up so I can get all the experience points needed to protect myself. And so in using that dynamic, that's why I like force sports kind of like met those needs. And what really kind of manifests as how trauma typically will manifest in a dojo is we'll see just a lot of frustration on little things, kind of like blowing up. And being able to understand this, whether you know the details of someone's trauma or not, because you don't need to know the details, but knowing how to communicate differently when you come across a situation where someone is either behaving or speaking in a way that just completely baffles your mind, or if they are not able to connect to particular dots that just seem very easy for anyone else. And being able to communicate in the sense that, so if you're having a hard practice, and actually this is from my own experience, having a very, very difficult practice, I was struggling to learn a particular throw and learn the dynamics of grip fighting and judo. And at this particular practice, I wasn't upset at the practice or the coaches. I was having an emotional flashback. And if you're not familiar with an emotional flashback, it typically happens with individuals who are traumatized. And that is, think of when we know of a normal flashback where you're kind of like hearing and experiencing those sights and sounds from your trauma. And sometimes it comes with a visual or an auditory piece. An emotional flashback is, there is no visual auditory piece. You are just feeling that you're in the moment. And your body can't tell whether you are in the present day or you're in the past. And so as I was having this emotional flashback, I was incredibly frustrated. And the individual I was going with, he noticed that. And as we were sparring, he was also able to tell that my anger and my frustration had nothing to do with him and more to do with me. And so he asked me as we were going, it was like, "Are you angry?" I was like, "Yeah, I'm angry." He was like, "Good, bring it with you." Not as in like, we're just going to duke it out, like bring that anger with you so we can like figure out how to let that go. And like, as we were sparring, he didn't become more aggressive. And skilled martial artists will know this. There's a difference between just turning up the heat a bit and then becoming really aggressive. He just turned up the heat a bit so he can meet me where I was. And he didn't go any further and he didn't come any less. He met me where I was and he allowed me to essentially fight that anger out in the moment. And then he kind of stopped the match there. Kind of like a counselor would stop a therapy session when you are kind of getting into an emotional piece right before the end of it, kind of stopping it so that you're not emotionally vulnerable before you go out into the real world. So he did this with the match. He stopped it at a certain point and it was like, "All right, how are you feeling now?" And like, it gave me a second to stop, collect myself, be within my body, feel my own presence and be like, I'm a little more tired. I was able to fight that out. And like the emotional flashback began to really dissipate. And once that began to dissipate, like the judo began to click. I was more engaged with that practice. I was more connected to this individual. And that's a moment that I'll never forget. Mm-hmm. And again, what that being trauma informed teaches is how to communicate differently when you are coming against someone or coaching someone who needs that additional care, who needs someone to just take a step back and ask questions rather than pushing the agenda forward. And so like having those understandings and also having the emotional connection to, and teaching individuals to have an emotional connection to what they're doing also yields for better results. And like bringing the emotional into the physical and allowing that space in there. It's like, all right, what, and definitely like in my own practice, not even just going out in my day-to-day, but if I'm going into a tournament, like I call it the warrior's calm, where I will essentially kind of like go in internally and sit with all my emotions, all my feelings that I'm feeling, whether I'm aware of them or not, and try to identify as many as I can. And in doing so, identifying, all right, which ones are going to hinder me in this workout, in this tournament, in this practice, and which ones are going to help me. And then identifying and pulling and bringing with me those ones that I need. So whether that's the excitement, whether that's the animosity of just, I need to be agitated in this tournament to like get my mind in the right place to fight this rival of mine that I've been fighting for several years and been losing to, or curiosity in learning and in being ready to accept new information. But if there's any negative emotions like resentment, fear, anger that are kind of like boiled up in there, we find that it's harder to learn because then the body doesn't feel safe. The body doesn't feel safe to take in new information. And the learning process of any martial art, anything in general, and I see this in the classroom where I teach, I see this in society, when the body doesn't have a sense of safety within itself or within the environment, then learning doesn't happen. You'll just kind of be repeating the same motions. You'll be doing the practices, but the information isn't sinking in. It's like you're trying to absorb water with a plastic sponge that is completely solid and has no holes in it and doesn't absorb water. And it's just a plastic brick and it's not a sponge. And so you're not actually getting in information. You're almost repelling that information when you are trying to go into it with those negative emotions that kind of act as barriers. And one of the things that I've begun to introduce, not only in my own life, but into my classroom where I taught and into the dojo where I've taught as well, is breath work with a strong focus on breath work. And not just like having a 5-year-old in the corner, just take a few breaths and then come back in, get with the group, but literal actual breath work in the sense of 10, 20, 30 minutes of just breathing, deep breathing, different exercises within that. Because what we're doing when we are controlling the breath, when we are consciously making an effort to slow our breathing, be in tune with our bodies, we're communicating that we're safe. And then regardless of the trauma or lack thereof, regardless of the environment, once we've communicated to the body that we're safe, and I think breath work is vital for anyone, regardless of trauma, it just as a human condition, just knowing how to breathe, because again, when the first thing that changes when we're stressed or when our emotions become spiked is our breath. We tend to hold it, it becomes shortened. We tend to, you ever like know someone who like begins, they just keep talking and they find out that they're out of breath and they have no more words left, but they're still trying to get all the words out because they just want to finish that last breath and they're always out of breath. Having breath work will help to begin to alleviate that sort of thing, but also give us more capacity to breathe, to use our lungs. When we're using that more, we're creating a sense of safety with the breath, the body begins to respond accordingly. And then learning becomes easier. Sitting with discomfort of a particular move or a particular environment becomes a lot easier. And also kind of coming back to the piece of trauma and like understanding that a lot of the moves that we do, particularly in judo and Brazilian jiu-jitsu and wrestling, that can be very triggering for a lot of individuals who have trauma, particularly violent trauma. So being wary of that and always putting an emphasis, all right, before we learn this technique, before we move into this, we're going to stop for a few minutes, do some breath work, allow our minds to sort of settle, either whether it's from the day, whether it's from the trauma. But again, as a coach, you don't necessarily need to know all those details. It's, again, that understanding that anyone can come to your club with these particular things. And it kind of really serves as a good general understanding to use when teaching a martial art, when teaching a combative sport, where we are getting physical, there is a lot of violence to it, to always teach, no matter how agitated you get, no matter what happens in the dojo, in the club, come back to your breath. Come back to your breath whenever you are needing to calm down, whenever you are needing to step away from one match and move into another to learn new information. And so to kind of just like review the things that I think are just incredibly helpful are having a nuanced, even if it's a general surface level understanding of trauma. A good book to read, really, Bessel van der Kolk, The Body Keeps the Score, excellent book to read for anyone. That, along with Complex Post-Traumatic Stress from Surviving to Thriving, and The Transformation. All great books on trauma. You can just read the first couple chapters and you'll get a good understanding. But then with that, bringing the idea of like looking up breath work and meditation and really, really bringing that into the dojo and really kind of hinging on that. And then being able to identify, and this is definitely true for coaches, identify when someone's emotions are flared up and when they're like engaged. It's hard to tell. And I'm sure like some coaches here are able to tell with, especially individuals that they've worked with longer, but being able to kind of like spread that net even further. And like anyone who walks in, I want to kind of be reading this person. I want to be like wanting to know like what are they wanting to bring to the table, what their goals are, and then how you can best help them. And so again, just that being trauma informed, breath work, and then learning how to communicate differently whenever it calls for it.
Wow, thank you so much for all of that, D'Artagnan. There's a lot of information there and a lot of very valuable information. I'm hearing in all of what you're saying, you know, using the breath work for, I guess, for coaches for their own emotional intelligence so that they can be actively listening and receptive, open to the emotional state of their athletes, their players. You know, and of course, that is of benefit to all players, not just people with disabilities, you know, women also the same, you know, everybody. It's really an all-inclusive approach. Thank you so much for sharing that. And so I'll put those books that you mentioned, you know, if you're listening to the recording, we'll put them on the end, the closing slide, along with details of the future webinars as well. Thank you so much for that, D'Artagnan, all of that information. And insight, you know, it's from your own personal experience too, isn't it? And your own learning. We have a question that came through in the chat from Andre a few moments ago, quite a while ago. So I'll put it to you all here, and maybe you can, each of you might have something to share or add. So Andre is asking, have you ever considered the cultural aspects? So I think it says Nick in brackets. So maybe it is clear that in the US, sports is more accessible for people with impairments. How about Eastern Europe, Africa, some parts of Asia? It's extremely challenging to fight against this general social perception in some places. And this is based on Andre's own experience. So would you like to come in there, Nick, or any of you, if you've traveled, you may also have some more insight there.
I certainly can. I don't want to take up a ton of time with this, but just to kind of support what the individual is saying. For example, my experience when I initially started training in Japan, I was very, very lucky, and I found a judo sensei who had lived spent considerable time in the US, and he really liked some of the teaching practices that he had seen in the US, and he kind of had adopted those in his dojo in Japan. And after a couple of years, I actually enrolled in what was a full-time judo instructor's course in what is a Budo university. And Japan has universities that are dedicated purely to the sports and to martial arts. So I did a foreign exchange program with a university in Japan where I did judo full-time. And in that environment is where I met a lot of resistance from the male students, in particular, who didn't want to train with an individual with a disability, because there are a couple potentially, you could say cultural, but I think you can see this as much in Japan as you could see it anywhere in the world. The men that were on the team, they didn't want to compete with me because they didn't want to risk losing to a person with a disability, because that could be very embarrassing to them. And also others just underestimated how I could benefit their training. So what happened in that instance in particular was that the head coach of the university, his name is Kashiwazaki. He was I think a two-time gold, a two-time world champion, judo world champion. He pulled me aside and he said, "Look, I know this is going to sound weird, but come train with the women's team, because the women's team, A, is better than the men's team because they're more technical, but B, is the women's team has dealt with years of discrimination of their own, and they're not going to discriminate against you. They're going to treat you like they would treat anyone else." And it was true. When I started training with the women's team, they were, I never had a single round of what's called rendori, so a single round of fighting where I was taking a break. I always had a training partner, and they came at me 110%. And it really benefited my judo. And then later on, I would go and compete with men, and I would beat some of the same men who previously were reluctant to train with me. So you do run into these cultural aspects of cultural stigmatism. And I mean, the only advice I can really give, because it's so dependent on the culture that you find yourself in, but you look for those little hacks and you look for those little tricks, whereas you find the instructor, and sometimes it's the head instructor, sometimes it's a junior instructor, sometimes it's another student, but you have to kind of sometimes find that foot in the door, or find that individual who's willing to support you and is willing to work with you. Or I mean, maybe you have to consider working with a different group. Don't stop at your first club. Don't stop at your first dojo. If you meet resistance or reluctance, keep trying. In my case, it was, being the only man that was training with the women's judo team. That was fine because it was great training. And that's not going to work for every case or every situation, but it's those kind of like alternative ways or flexibility of kind of an approach to this. So try multiple clubs, try multiple gyms, or try to find that individual in the club that's going to help you build a bridge to the rest of the individuals. And this is one thing that's really important for instructors and coaches to really understand, is as a coach, part of your responsibility is making sure that that sort of thing doesn't happen, is trying to make sure that you don't have one individual who is sitting on the side the entire time. And as a coach, one of the things that you can do is put that individual, whether it be an individual with a disability, whether it be a new woman to the dojo, whether it be a new anyone to the dojo, or club or gym, maybe think about partnering them up with a trusted senior student, somebody who has respect within that dojo. And, that's going to help start the process for other people seeing that individual and saying, like, look, if the senior student at this club is working with this individual, that must mean I should too. It's those little strategies to help break down barriers and build bridges within the greater kind of community of the club.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you for your insight. And also to add, Andre, social change takes time, and maybe in your context, maybe you are the one. If there isn't a lot of inclusion in your area, maybe it's you.
What about the kind of cultural, the sort of culture of martial arts in general? Because I mean, thinking about what D'Artagnan said earlier, that concept of, because I mean, I've experienced this massively. I mean, particularly with dyspraxia, there's this huge frustration that comes with it, because again, it's because you don't look any different and there is on the surface nothing physically wrong with you. There is this thing that both comes externally and internally. Why can't you do it? And then you're feeling like, why can't I do it? So that concept of like sitting with things, I mean, it's genius, but the difficulty is that in martial arts, there's often this culture of, like martial arts has its own culture, and it's often this culture of, suck it up, push through it, even if you're injured. And then you wonder, like, why am I constantly injured? Why am I always getting ill? And why am I always feeling really frustrated and exhausted and not getting it? And I actually had to go through quite a while of having this attitude, and I was constantly, doing too much training and burning out, and then getting really frustrated with myself before I had to go, hey, this isn't working. I need to rethink this and do something that makes a bit more sense. But what I want to put out there is the idea that maybe there's not just issues with cultures in terms of countries, but maybe there's a problem with the culture of martial arts in general, because there is a big culture of, oh, train even if you're sick, train if you're train through your injury, even though actually you should go and get an ice pack, and then you get injured more, and now your career is over.
Oh my gosh, Tanya.
So how do we address that?
One, I second everything you said, because there definitely is a culture within martial arts. So and I have two particular stories that come to mind. One story, I was in Turkmenistan. I went there for a goodwill trip as a US envoy, as an athlete envoy. And the goal there was to help strengthen our relationship with the country of Turkmenistan. And they thought no better way to do it than through sport. They recognized that the country has a stigma toward individuals who are blind and visually impaired. And I also heard this growing up in middle school in the US, that if you do any kind of sport, any sort of physical activity, your vision will go where? Your vision will just go, it'll be bad, everything will be horrible, the black hole will appear and suck everything up. So visually impaired and blind athletes just weren't a thing. And when I first got there, the national team was there, only a part of them. And they showed up knowing that I was visually impaired. One of the coaches who came with me is a woman. And she came there, and we both came there, and we were just going to give a short demonstration on this is sort of how we train Paralympic judo. And clearly there was a lot of dismissal. There was just a lack of respect that you can just feel. And it was because there was a visually impaired martial artist and a female martial artist at that. And after we actually got into it, got our gis on and started doing judo, and I put one of the guys through the basement and proved that my vision isn't a barrier to me kicking your butt. That's what kind of showed that respect. But what I brought to the door immediately was my own sense of self-worth, because I recognized that I don't care what these people think. I'm already a bronze medalist in the sport of judo. Anyone who I need to prove anything to, I've already done it. And not boiling my self-worth down to my limitation, nor to the ideals of martial artists who look down on individuals. And so what happened was the next day, the entire national team showed up. And first it was 3 to 5 people who only showed up. And then 45 individuals showed up to help us coach a visually impaired judo camp, which was just phenomenal, because again, showing that respect. Another one, this was at the Olympic Training Center, where I had been personally training for, at the time I was there for 6 years. We had new coaches that had come in who were only involved with coaching sighted athletes. I had come back from an injury, and I was down at 178 pounds. So I was down at 81 kilos. While we were warming up, I went to go warm up with an individual named Nick Del Popolo. He is a 73 kilo fighter, so I'm only one weight class different from him. This was great for me and great for him, because I was the only other person in the dojo close to his weight. And he was someone light enough where I can do throws while recovering from my injury. His girlfriend at the time, who was the coach for some stupid reason, decided that no, that's not okay, because I don't trust that you as a visually impaired person, athlete, what have you, is good enough to go with my partner or with my boyfriend. And so she divided us up and had a 90 kilo fighter go with Nick and had me go with the 2 heaviest, hardest to throw dudes in the room. She was like, yeah, that's a good matchup. I almost left the entire dojo and burned that place to the ground. I never felt so disrespected being in my own home dojo from a new coach to say, no, you're not good enough to train here. You train with these heavier individuals, which these 2 individuals, both of them were 2 and 3 weight classes above me. Terrible, terrible for training, especially coming back from an injury. And halfway through practice, I left, because again, my self-worth, I wasn't going to boil down to that individual. Mm-hmm. And what we find is that, yeah, it's absolutely less about the impairment, less about the culture, but the mindset of individuals who are in martial arts a lot of times, because it is that like you fight until you die kind of thing. That like it doesn't matter like what the condition or what the impairment is. If you have a full able body, then you'll be good at this sport. But if you are perceived to have some kind of limitation or lack thereof, and you just can't do it, then you become less than. You're not on this like elite level. And the biggest thing that I found with like changing that culture is more inclusivity for sure, but also teaching individuals a way to, again, not boil their self-worth down, because I think that's what kind of stops people from going and stops people from showing up when things like that happen. When like a visually impaired person will newly come to a dojo and they're just sitting in the corner the whole time because no one wants to touch them, no one wants to be around them. Or someone who has some sort of cognitive or physical disorder or condition that is not visible on the surface is having a hard time showing up and almost being harassed to a degree of like, why can't you be better when we don't have those answers? And it's not about just being better. I have to learn differently than you learned. And I think because a lot of martial artists think that there's a one size fits all to training, we forget that there are different abilities. We forget that there are, thinking back to how Tanya learned, I don't remember the name of the technique, but learned the technique, but through a different process than I'm sure that anyone else learned it. Mm-hmm. She learned it in a process that worked for her. And that's the same with other individuals. But it's hard to allow that to become more nuanced when, again, it is that very elitist culture that many martial artists tend to have, especially in regards to women and individuals with limitations. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I guess I can't really stress this enough, but like really, and this is what I teach to individuals going in the sport, regardless of their impairment, regardless of their background, is to find yourself before the sport. Because, and I'm one of the individuals who like did it backwards, who I found the sport and then I found myself after. But finding yourself before the sport, regardless of however you're presenting to that sport and whoever is presenting back, you're not going to get caught up on, it'll be harder, I'll say, for you to allow your confidence and allow your ability to be boiled down to by someone else's opinion. And then you'll find more access and agency in finding a club that will meet your needs. And like, I need to train and I need someone who's going to accommodate like how I need, or being able to stand up for yourself. Because I actually had it out with this lady at some point and just letting her know that like, hey, you're actually a terrible coach. And our program went downhill when you got here because of how you treated the Paralympic guys. This was a Paralympic friendly dojo until you came here. And like that changes when, again, people who don't, it's less about what they know, but more about what they think they know and more about what they absolutely don't know in regards to people with impairments. Because again, on the surface, they'll think they know that this person coming into the dojo with an impairment is at this level, rather than like just meeting them where they are and then kind of taking it from there.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, D'Artagnan. And I think that's a lovely way to wrap up. We've gone a little bit beyond the time of our webinar, and I just want to thank everyone for staying with us and for that insight. And so as you were sharing there, D'Artagnan, one of our guests, Andre, he said that was the point, your point about when you were in was it that other country, I can't recall, that you mentioned. He said that was really what he was considering, about the inclusion and how, for people with visual impairments. There is another question in there, but we're not going to have time to answer it, but we do have some Q&A sessions lined up. And I have put the schedule for the whole the remaining webinars and the webinar series into the chat for all of you who are listening. And in the interest of respecting your time, it's almost time to wrap up. But before we do that, I'd like to go to each of our panelists and see if you have one piece of advice, one short and sweet, maybe in one sentence, if you could sum up in one short sentence a key point that you think is really important for coaches to understand when it comes to inclusion. So Nick, would you like to go first?
Sure. I guess in just one sentence, what I would say to coaches is no individual is working alone. Inclusion is a process of everyone working together.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you. Tanya?
Don't underestimate people.
Wonderful. Thank you. Samantha, can we hear from you?
The one thing that I would add is in reference to the one size fits all, even people with the same disability learn differently.
Thank you, Samantha. And D'Artagnan?
I think of a quote by Maya Angelou for coaches and just anyone. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better.
Oh, wonderful. Well, that is a wonderful quote to wrap up our webinar. I wish to thank each of our panelists from the bottom of my heart and from on behalf of all of our attendees. We have some thank you coming in the chat as well also. I wish to thank each of our attendees for joining us, for joining this conversation. We hope that there's been plenty of nuggets of wisdom for each of you. And we wish to see you again. So our next webinar, and I know I was going to say in some of the what you were saying, what you brought up, Tanya, in terms of the culture, some of that may actually be covered. Our next webinar is on Thursday, and it's about tradition and inclusion, looking at how tradition in martial arts, when it's predominantly tradition-based, you know, a lot of martial arts are based on tradition, looking at how tradition can both facilitate inclusion and on some ways be a challenge or a barrier to inclusion. And I know in one of our later webinars on women and girls, they look at that as well. It comes up in the conversation as well. So thank you to each and every one, and we hope to be with you all again soon. And we wish you a wonderful, wonderful day, morning, evening, wherever you are in the world. Thank you all.